Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Organization of Iranian American Communities webinar, Beyond Missiles and Diplomacy, the 12-Day War and the Path to a Free Iran. I'm pleased to join you again to moderate this important discussion, where we will examine the complexities of regime dynamics in Iran and why internal resistance, not military intervention, may represent the only viable path to lasting democratic change. During the next hour, we will explore three key themes through structured segments. First, the historical and military context of foreign interventions that have repeatedly failed. Second, what some see as the regime's growing vulnerabilities and the momentum of Iran's organized resistance. And finally, the role of international policy in supporting the calls for a secular, democratic, non-nuclear republic. We're grateful to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Dr. Ramesh Sepehrrad, a scholar practitioner at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, who will ground us in the military and historical lessons that underscore the dangers of foreign-sponsored regime change. Dr. Sascha Sheehan, a leading U.S. foreign policy expert on Iran, professor, and associate dean in the College of Public Affairs at the University of Baltimore, who will shed light on the regime's perceived internal weaknesses and the rise of the pro-democracy movement. Dr. Azadeh Sami, a board-certified physician and founding member of the OIAC professional chapter, who will speak about the recent atrocities, including the execution of two political prisoners, Behrouz Ehsani and Mehdi Ehsani, and why the international community must urgently support the Iranian people's demand for regime change. Each panelist will respond to our questions, provide context and analysis, and take your questions at the end. We encourage all participants, especially members of the media, to engage with the panel during our live Q&A session. Before we begin with our experts, as reported by several news agencies, including Reuters, on July 27th, the Iranian regime executed two political prisoners, Behrouz Ehsani and Mehdi Ehsani, both members of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, or the MEK. These were not obscure cases. Their arrests, their resilience under brutal conditions for over 3 years, and the charges against them, condemned as completely fabricated, have been well documented by international human rights organizations and members of the European Parliament. They were accused of waging war on God, a charge used by Tehran in the past to silence dissidents. Their execution, carried out at dawn in the infamous Gezel Hisar prison, has drawn sharp condemnation from across the globe, from lawmakers in North America, the UK, and elsewhere in Europe. Iranian diaspora also held protests in capitals from Berlin and London to Washington, D.C. But beyond the outrage, it's critical to understand what this act represents to many around the world, a calculated attempt by the regime to instill fear and to signal that even amidst international pressure, it is doubling down on repression. That's why our first speaker's insights are so important. Dr. Sami is not only a board-certified physician and a founding member of the OIAC's professional chapter, but she's also someone who has long advocated for human rights and international accountability when it comes to Iran. Her voice is particularly vital today as the world weighs how to respond not just with words of condemnation, but with concrete action. Dr. Sami, in the wake of these executions, we've heard from the National Council of Resistance of Iran's president-elect, Maryam Rajavi, and other human rights defenders who warn that the regime is prepared for a broader wave of political killings, drawing on the same brutal playbook it has used in the massacre of political prisoners during the summer of 1988. So the question for you today is, what do these executions tell us about the regime's current mindset? And what should the international community do differently, especially when it comes to supporting Iran's internal resistance and holding the regime accountable?
Well, Mark, first of all, I want to thank you on behalf of OIAC for moderating this very timely panel. I know this is the second time you've joined us on these panels, and we really do appreciate it. And thank you for that question and spotlighting this very urgent crisis. The executions of Behrouz Ehsani and Mehdi Hassani are not just isolated acts of violence. They are part of a broader, deeply rooted strategy by the Iranian regime, one that relies on systematic terror, state-sponsored murder, and the brutal silencing of dissent as tools of political survival. Mr. Ehsani was 70 years old. Mr. Hassani was 48 years old. Both had spent more than 3 years in custody, and they've endured relentless torture, medical neglect, and isolation, only to be executed without warning. And as noted by Mr. Hassani's daughter, who lives in Europe, their bodies have yet to be returned to their families for proper burial. And most likely the regime will bury both in secret. So let's be clear, this was not just an execution. It was an act of calculated cruelty by a regime that has long used aging political prisoners as both hostages and as warnings. These executions are part of a broader pattern, a post-war purge carried out in the shadow of the recent 12-day conflict with the resistance movement inside Iran. And what we're witnessing is a regime lashing out in fear, trying to regain control by silencing the voices of the dissent, particularly those with a history of resistance. As was reported by the French news agency, President-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, Mariam Rajavi, has called this a brutal crime and warned that the regime's impunity only fuels public outrage. Her words were very clear. She says, "This brutality only intensifies the outrage of the Iranian people and reinforces the determination of Iran's courageous youth to bring an end to this theocratic tyranny." These two political prisoners' only crime was being affiliated with the MEK and refusing to renounce their commitment to a democratic, secular republic in Iran. Just like thousands before, who all faced the charge of moharebe, or waging war on God, a term that is so vague, so politically charged in religious fascism context, and has been used since the early 1980s. In the summer of 1988, this charge was used to massacre over 30,000 political prisoners, most of them MEK members, after the summary trials that lasted just mere minutes. It's the same term used in recent years to execute young protesters after the 2022 uprising. It's both a legal fabrication and a death sentence. So what makes this moment particularly alarming is the regime's timing and tone. These executions come just weeks after the end of the 12-day war with Israel and amid escalating tensions with the IAEA, the US, and Europe over the nuclear issue. They come at a time when Tehran is facing growing unrest at home over many issues, over inflation, over water shortages, and most recently, over the bread prices. People from across Iran, from teachers to retirees to bakers, are constantly protesting in the streets. And in response, the regime is doing what it always does when it feels threatened. It kills. So I argue from the top, Khamenei and his entire regime is sending a message to the people of Iran who are thinking of resisting. The message is, we can do what we did in 1988 and no one will stop us. So the real question is, we all know the record of this regime, and therefore, is silence an option? And if not, what is the role of the international community and what must be done? So I would outline this in 3 points. First, these executions are intentional, state-sanctioned political murders. They're crimes against humanity, as documented by Amnesty International, and have been going on for more than 4 decades. They've continued because the world community chose talks and negotiations with a murderous regime of mullahs. The time is long overdue for the UN Human Rights Council to initiate an urgent investigation. And in this particular case, the names of those responsible, including prison officials like Warden Allah Karam Azizi and his deputies at the Ghazal Hassar prison, must be placed on international sanctions list. the case must be referred to the International Criminal Court. You know, just one day before these recent executions, more than 100 armed guards from Ghazal Hisar Prison's Special Forces, acting on orders from the warden and his deputies, Hassan Qobadi and Ismail Farajnejad, alongside intelligence agents, stormed the political prisoners' ward in Unit 4. In a brutal assault, inmates were beaten, bound in handcuffs and leg shackles. They had bags placed over their heads and were dragged across the floor before being forcibly taken to solitary confinement. As we sit here today, we don't know what is happening to them at this moment. So this is what the UN Human Rights Council must seek to answer and investigate. Naming and shaming these figures is a must. Second, the Western governments must fundamentally shift their approach. For too long, the policies toward Iran have prioritized diplomacy at the expense of human rights. We cannot speak of nuclear negotiations and regional de-escalation, all the while ignoring the execution of dissidents at home. The free world must adopt a human rights first policy. There are several other high-profile political prisoners such as Saeed Massoudi, Mariam Akbari Munfared, Ali Younisi and his father, Pakhshan Azizi, Zainab Jalalian, and many more who are at risk. Some are facing forced disappearances, and some are being transferred to remote prisons without any notifications to their families. So how much longer will the world community stand by and watch such crimes in silence? Third, and most importantly, there must be a recognition of the Iranian people's right to resist tyranny, as reflected in the bipartisan majority of House resolutions. The world to believe that there is no alternative, that it's either them or chaos. But we know that that's a lie. There is an alternative. It's organized, it's democratic, it's secular, and it's embodied in the NCRI and in the leadership of a woman, Mrs. Mariam Rajavi. The young people who are taken to the streets today, the prisoners who are enduring unspeakable conditions in places like Ghazal Hisar, and the families demanding justice outside prison gates, they are not just victims. They are agents of change, but they cannot stand alone. The international community has a moral and strategic obligation to stand with them. And that means amplifying their voices, supporting their resistance, and making it clear to the regime that the era of impunity is over, and that the only way to signal that to the people of Iran is to recognize their legitimate fight against Tehran's regime and the terrorist IRGC thugs. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this topic and issue, but these are the three must-haves in my view.
Indeed, and thank you for those 3 points, Doctor. And with that in mind, let's turn to Dr. Sheehan. Dr. Sheehan, from your perspective, I'm really curious, what is fueling this, and how do you interpret these recent killings in light of the military and political setbacks that Tehran has faced, particularly after the 12-day conflict and the organized resistance?
Well, Mark, it's good to be with you. You know, I would open by noting that it's very clear that the Iranian regime is panicked. It's panicked because it recognizes that it's no longer governing from a position of strength. It's governing from a position of fear. You know, even setting aside the current existential crisis confronting the Ayatollahs, the writing has been on the wall for quite some time. The fact of the matter is the Iranian people have grown tired, deeply tired, of living under a corrupt and repressive theocracy. And the discontent on the Iranian street has reached a new high this summer. You know, this fatigue is manifested in unmistakable ways. The public rejection of the regime, as demonstrated by literally dozens of nationwide uprisings in recent years, makes one thing quite clear. The system is at a breaking point. The days of portraying dissent as isolated or externally manufactured are over. The chants we're hearing in the streets, rejecting both the supreme leader and the Shah, signal something quite profound. And that is that Iranians are no longer seeking simple reform of their government. They're no longer seeking regime modification. They're seeking fundamental democratic change. The panic in Tehran stems from the realization that the question is no longer if the regime will fall, but when. Mark, it's important that we not sugarcoat this in the West. Economically, the situation is catastrophic. The Iranian currency has been in a decline all summer. Inflation is strangling the average citizen. Corruption is endemic. And while regime elites continue to line their pockets, everyday Iranians are forced to choose between food and medicine. Internally, the cracks in the regime's foundation are widening. Cleavages within the ruling class among clerics and IRGC commanders and intelligence officials, they're all on full display for the world to see. And the loyalties, once taken for granted, are no longer guaranteed. Day to day and week to week, there are purges and silences that speak volumes and signs of deep mistrust, even within the core institutions that have historically enforced repression. Externally, the regime's regional adventurism has also backfired. Its destabilizing influence from Lebanon to Yemen has only deepened its isolation and undermined its credibility abroad. And perhaps most importantly, the regime today faces a resistance movement inside and outside the country that is more sophisticated and more networked and more determined than ever before. These are not disorganized expressions of protest. What we're witnessing today are all of the ingredients for a full-scale revolt from within. So you ask, why is the regime panicked? Well, it's panicked because it knows that its model of governance, built on brutality and advanced through deceit and reliant on fear, is unsustainable in the face of a population that's simply no longer afraid. It's watching the pillars of its authority fold like a deck of cards. Iran's leaders today lack the political, economic, ideological, and moral will to govern. And those at the top understand something that outside observers are only beginning to fully grasp, but scholars have long understood, and that's this. Once popular momentum reaches a certain threshold, authoritarian regimes don't gradually fade away. They often unravel quite swiftly. Mark, I participated in more than a dozen interviews during the 12-day war earlier this summer. And since this time, I've had some opportunity to reflect on what we witnessed. And I believe there are three irrefutable lessons from that conflict. The first is that the supreme leader's strategy has failed. The regime crossed a clear red line with its near weapons-grade enrichment and paid the price with targeted strikes. But perhaps more telling than what happened is what didn't. The fact of the matter is, Russia and China didn't come to Tehran's defense. And this silence confirmed what the Iranian resistance has long warned, that the regime's supposed alliances are hollow and its international isolation is deeper than it claims. The second lesson we learned is that diplomacy with the regime is reaching its end, even in Europe. After years of failed negotiations, deceit, and nuclear blackmail, even Europe is beginning to acknowledge the futility of appeasement and threatening the regime with triggering the snapback mechanism. The diplomatic framework that allowed the Islamic Republic to stall and then enrich and ultimately deceive is collapsing. And what comes next is not a new round of talks with Europe to kill time, but facing conditions that will cost this regime its survival. And the third lesson that we learned this summer is this: the regime's greatest fear is its internal organized resistance. Iran's supreme leader doesn't fear foreign airstrikes as much as he fears what's rising from within, and that is the people of Iran, organized and determined to take back their future. And that's why his response, Mark, after the war wasn't diplomatic outreach. It was a wave of political execution targeting MEK members and the dissident community. This is not a regime acting from a position of strength. It's one cracking under pressure and lashing out at its most feared threat, and that is internal rebellion by an organized pro-democracy alternative.
Doctor, thank you. And a note for our audience, please look for the Q&A tab if you would like to put questions for our panelists there. It is separate than the chat panel, and we will take questions at the end of this webinar. So feel free to add your questions to the Q&A dialog box. Thank you. Dr. Sepehrrad, you've spent years studying Iran's modern history, examining both foreign interventions and the Islamic Republic's methods of survival, from the mass crackdowns of the 1980s to the current wave of executions. In fact, our audience should know your own family lived through political persecution, both the Shah's regime and the current theocracy. So looking at this broader arc of history across two dictatorships, what strategies for change do you think have proven effective, and which approaches have failed?
Thank you, Mark. And I just want to echo Azadeh's sentiment for moderating this important panel as well. And it's great to be on this panel with both Dr. Sami and Dr. Sheehan. You're absolutely right. My family, like so many others, experienced repression under both the Shah's monarchy and the current theocratic regime. While this is deeply personal, it's also profoundly relevant to what we're dealing with on Iran today. If you were to kind of take a step back and think of it from a historic perspective, Iranian people really lived through a very different brands of dictatorship. One was cloaked under a superficial nationalism and Western alliance, and the other one has, which is the current regime, is the religious fundamentalism and leverages the anti-Western rhetoric. So at its core, the system has really, between the two dictatorships, they have common threats, and they both deny political freedom. They both stand on one-party system. They both subscribe to one institutionalized religion, which is Islam, and they both stand on violent suppression of dissent, refuse to allow people to voice their own future, subjugate women in different ways, but they both subjugate women and different Iranian nationalities and minorities. And of course, not to mention, both the Shah and the current regime pursue nuclear power and regional hegemony. So in many ways, both regimes of the current regime of the mullahs and the Shah are two sides of the same coin. So to fully explain what has worked and what has not worked, we must really look at both internal resistance as well as the international policy and the foreign policies of the different countries. So I would categorize it as such. First, what has never worked is appeasement or foreign imposed change or a regime change. In Iran's modern history, it really offers us two clear examples, two clear case studies. One, and both of those case studies, quite frankly, failed and ended in failure. So one was from the stage of 1921 to 1979, when Iran experienced two Western-backed regime changes. In 1921, Reza Khan seized power in British engineered coup. He transformed himself from a military officer to a foreign installed monarch. He replaced the Qajar dynasty with the Pahlavi dynasty. But then his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, came to power in 1941 after the British government and the Soviet Union, Soviets forced his father to abdicate during the World War II. So the younger Shah later consolidated his rule with the help of the 1953 CIA coup against the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. So for 58 years, the Pahlavis dynasty governed with external backing and no internal legitimacy. And in the end, it collapsed under the weight of its own repression, proving that the foreign engineered monarchies cannot deliver lasting freedom or stability in the region. Then we had the 1979 revolution, which was in fact a very authentic revolution. People came to the streets, overthrew the Shah's regime, but it was hijacked. It was hijacked, and the pendulum swung on the other direction when it comes to foreign policy on Iran. This time, the West decided to really place its bet on appeasement, believing that the Islamic Republic could be moderated through dialogues, concession, or nuclear agreements. Now, we know decades of engagement, both at least from the US policy perspective, under the Democratic and a Republican administration, produced nothing but broken promises. Engagement didn't deliver anything. The regime responded not with reform, but with more killing, with more executions and crackdown. We have witnessed regional terrorism, proxy war, and of course, a very relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons program. In both of these cases, the result was the same. The Iranian people paid the price, and the world miscalculated its policy on Iran. So the harsh truth is that appeasement has become the cornerstone of Western failure in Iran since 1979. It has emboldened the regime. It has legitimized the brutality. It has prolonged the grip of mullah's power. Just as foreign imposed monarchs that proved to be illegitimate and non-effective, the idea that this regime can also be reformed from within is equally delusional. So another major failure that I would refer to is Western inability to grasp regime's strategy of deception and understanding what is regime's Achilles heel. So this is, again, from a Western point of view and a foreign policies that has been applied when it comes to dealing with Iran. So on the issue of nuclear issue, where the deception really worked for Khamenei is that he never sought a genuine compromise. Iran's supreme leader never really wanted a working deal with the West. His regime's survival has always been hinged on a deliberate, well-rehearsed strategy when it comes to nuclear power, which was stall negotiations, enrich uranium behind the closed doors, inch towards the nuclear weapons program under the illusion of diplomacy. And just like North Korea, he used talks not to resolve tension, but to buy time and build leverage. One example that comes to mind is that even during the JCPOA, Tehran was secretly expanding centrifuge capabilities and reinforcing its nuclear sites. So when Khamenei said in March of 2025, when the tension were at all-time highs and there were talk of military confrontation, this is what he said. He said, and I'm quoting, "There will be no talks and no war." When he said this, it wasn't a statement of strength, but it was a calculated bet. He assumed that the West lacked the resolve to act, with that even if he faces limited missile strikes, if they come, they were a price that was worth paying to avoid something far more dangerous for him, which was an uprising from within. And I think Sascha just pointed to that. The gamble laid bare his deepest fear. His deepest fear is not war, but rebellion. Is not bombs, but resistance. So let's be very clear when it comes to what didn't work in Iran's case, which is diplomacy has failed, appeasement has enabled the regime, and airstrikes alone will not bring a change that is meaningful for the people of Iran. What the regime truly fears and what the world must finally recognize is that a determined, organized resistance rooted in Iranian people themselves is in fact the Achilles heel, is what I was referring to earlier. So let me turn to what has worked, which is what really gives me hope, is the solution that comes from inside Iran. It is the support by majority of bipartisan members of Congress in multiple House resolutions, including the House Resolution 166 that Dr. Sami referred to, and 4,000 parliamentarians from across Europe and elsewhere. A solution that is also known as a third option. It was introduced by Maryam Rajavi 21 years ago in 2004. And that solution says that regime change from within is led by the people of Iran and by their organized resistance, which is what I call an Iranian regime change. This is not a slogan. It is a decade-long movement rooted in sacrifice and political planning and a strategy that has the popular support inside Iran. You know, after the 12-day war and when the ceasefire was announced, Maryam Rajavi from the National Council of Resistance of Iran welcomed the ceasefire immediately because she is confident and knows what it takes to bring this regime down. She knows what's worked, she knows what doesn't work, and if there's one lesson to be learned across these two dictatorships that I just referred to from a historical standpoint is you cannot bomb your way to a democracy. You cannot negotiate your way around a tyranny. You cannot install monarchy, but you can and you must support those inside Iran who are ready to pay the price for freedom.
Thank you, Dr. Sepehrrad. Dr. Sami, I want to come back to you. Amnesty International says that the executions of Behruz Asani and Mehdi Hassani were carried out in complete secrecy without notifying their families after years of torture, forced confessions, and a trial that lasted, reports say, all of 5 minutes. Amnesty also warns that at least 19 others, including women's rights defenders, Kurdish activists, and MEK supporters, are at imminent risk of execution under similar conditions. What does this expanding list of at-risk prisoners tell us about the regime's long-term strategy? And do you believe we are witnessing the early stages of a coordinated political purge, potentially modeled on what happened in 1988?
Well, yes, obviously we're all still very affected by the news of the two political prisoners you just mentioned. We're still digesting it, very troubled and affected by it. This is the textbook method of Tehran's criminal regime, and this is the method that they've used for decades to eliminate its opposition. And today, that vulnerability is profound. As I mentioned before, after the 12-day war, after waves of domestic protests, and after the rising international scrutiny, the regime is now defaulting to the one tool that it trusts most, and that is fear through execution. As a physician, I must also speak to the medical and ethical violations here. I mean, prolonged solitary confinement, denial of medical care, the use of physical and psychological torture. They're not just human rights abuses. These are forms of deliberate, as I mentioned before, deliberate state-sponsored medical neglect. And as such, they should be condemned by every medical association and humanitarian institution worldwide. I mean, I really call on the World Medical Association, national and international physician unions, and healthcare-focused NGOs to really urgently raise their voices. In addition to what I said earlier, the silence from the medical community enables this kind of cruelty. As Dr. Sheehan was talking about the regime's fear and panic, I'd like to add that the resilience of the political prisoner, who also inspires the rest of society, is extremely impressive. Based on reports from inside Iran, female prisoners in Qarchak prison held a ceremony in honor of Mehdi Hassani and Behruz Asani, the executed political prisoners that we've been speaking of. And these women chanted, and I quote, "We will stand until the death penalty is abolished until the end. Death to the dictator, and the executioner regime must be overthrown." So when we hear these slogans from the prisoners, it's no wonder that the Free Iran platform presented by Mrs. Maryam Rajavi in a 10-point plan calls for abolishing the death penalty, establishing a moderate judicial system, a non-nuclear secular republic, and peaceful coexistence with other countries, in addition to free market economy and gender equality. This is what the future holds for Iran. Should the international community do its part to pivot from just condemnation with words and support the Iranians' rights to overthrow this regime?
Dr. Sami, you just described a people's choice to resist and ultimately overthrow a regime that rules through torture, executions, and fear. And as this panel's experts have described, pressure on the current regime is intensifying. So what happens the day after? What comes next if this regime falls? The governing, the rebuilding, the public trust. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to Dr. Sheehan now. Sarah, from your perspective, how prepared is the Iranian resistance to step in and stabilize the country? What structures, principles, leadership frameworks are in place you want the international community to be aware of and perhaps even support?
Well, Mark, that's an essential question, and it's one that separates wishful thinking from strategic foresight. And you're absolutely right to be turning your attention to the end game, because as I indicated earlier, when authoritarian regimes fall, they often collapse more quickly than anyone expected. Here's the bottom line. When it comes to the Islamic Republic, there is, as has been said today, a viable alternative to the clerical regime in Iran. But we need to keep it real. Not all opposition movements are created equal, and the international community must distinguish between those with deep roots, those with operational capacity, and those with genuine support inside the country, and those built on nostalgia and name recognition and simple media visibility. One such distraction receiving media attention this summer is the monarchist camp led by Reza Pahlavi. His prominence is quite simply a legacy of his father's rule, not the result of any sustained contribution to Iran's democratic struggle. Over the past 4 decades, he hasn't built a movement. He hasn't established a party or earned any credibility for establishing a political structure. His interventions are largely episodic, and his strategy is mostly undefined. And his base, which is largely external to the country and symbolic, lacks traction among the Iranian people. The truth is, Iranians haven't forgotten the repression of the Shah's era, his secret police, or the autocratic system that silenced dissent. The legacy that helped create the conditions for the Ayatollahs to hijack the '79 revolution are found in that era. And so Western authorities must not make the same mistake again by legitimizing figures who lack both moral credibility and operational relevance. Reza Pahlavi's past statements, for example, about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the very force responsible for mass murder inside and outside Iran, are not just naive, they're dangerous. This is a U.S. designated terrorist organization. And this is a man who said that it should have a role to play in a democratic Iran. This is absurd and it's offensive to the many victims of its violence. U.S. officials need to understand that this is not a time for weekend warriors or figureheads. Iran's future will not be secured by those who parachute in during moments of crisis. It will ultimately be secured by those who spent decades organizing and resisting and preparing for this democratic transition. You know, I've spent now 2 decades examining and writing about the Iranian opposition broadly construed. And there's one such movement that, from my perspective, stands above all the others. And that's the National Council of Resistance of Iran, or the NCRI. The NCRI is a broad-based coalition with the MEK, its largest constituent group, at its core. And as a political body with a defined structure, a plan for governance, and a leadership team ready to step in, the NCRI is structured to serve as a transitional government in the immediate aftermath of the regime's collapse. At the helm of this coalition is a president-elect, Maryam Rajavi, a Muslim woman who embodies both the modernity and the moderation that the Iranian people have long been denied. She's put forward, as has been described here today, a 10-point plan, a roadmap, if you will, that lays out the principles that would guide Iran through a democratic transition. Thousands of Western lawmakers across North America and Europe have already endorsed this plan and have done so since its inception almost 2 decades ago. So the fact of the matter is, the Iranian resistance is far more prepared to govern than many realize. Unlike spontaneous protest movements that arise without direction, or those that only hold forth in the media, the NCRI has a clearly articulated framework for transition. Its plans call for the establishment of a transitional government, limited to just 6 months, whose sole mandate is to organize free and fair elections for a constituent assembly. That body would then be responsible for drafting a new constitution and forming a representative government based on the will of the Iranian people. In other words, the model is structured to ensure a peaceful democratic transition without chaos or power vacuums. And the democratic principles that have been set forth to guide the transition align very, very well with international norms and human rights commitments. Take, for example, ballot box legitimacy as the exclusive source of political authority, gender equality with full rights for women in political, social, and economic life, autonomy for Iran's ethnic minorities, religious freedom with equal rights for Shia, Sunnis, Jews, Christians, Baha'is, and others in Iran, separation of religion and state characterized by a secular government that reflects pluralism and not religious tyranny. And very importantly, Mark, a foreign policy rooted in peace, including a non-nuclear Iran committed to regional stability. So to your question, yes, the Iranian resistance is prepared not just to fill the vacuum, but to guide the country toward a democratic order that reflects the aspirations of its people. What the international community must recognize at this crucial moment is that this movement is not only ready, it's reliable, it's responsible, and it's rooted in values that deserve our support. But this is not just a moral imperative. It's a matter of strategic international urgency, because a democratic Iran is essential to global security, regional stability, and the long-term interests of the West. From my perspective, what's needed now is a unified stance from Western democracies, one that acknowledges a simple but powerful truth. The Iranian people not only seek change, but they today have the leadership, the vision, and the organizational capacity to achieve it.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Sepehrrad, one other question here before we note some of the audience questions that are already in the Q&A box. In light of the 12-day war and everything we've discussed today, what specific actions would you like Western governments and international institutions to take now to support the Iranian people?
I think the 12-day war really exposed a decisive truth that Tehran is not strong on the outside, as Sascha mentioned earlier, and it's more fragile than anyone can really see on the surface on the inside. The regime's greatest threat is not foreign firepower, but it's the defiance of its own people. What's really needed now is clarity, is alignment, is principled action, is to stand unapologetically with the Iranian people and their organized resistance. The people of Iran are not asking for foreign money. They're not asking for troops on the ground. They're seeking a recognition of their fight for freedom. And the future of Iran, I believe, is going to be decided in the streets by the resistance units that are operating across all 31 provinces across the country. So the world really has to make a choice to either stand in the way of this movement or stand with it. That means there needs to be a strategic pivot away from missiles or appeasement-based framework, but towards an explicit political, diplomatic, and moral support for the regime change by the Iranian people. What Mariam Rajavi calls a third option. This is what's really important as a viable path to peace and democracy. And I think, as Sascha just outlined, the readiness, the operational readiness of the alternative, the viable alternative, is what really needs to be recognized and supported. I think I do want to add to what Sascha just mentioned, which is the model that he offered based on his studies and the plan that we see presented by the NCRI. It's really deeply rooted in the historic context, in the lessons learned, and based on what I raised earlier. And I think this is what will really deliver a solution that can be effective, that can really stabilize the region through a democratic Iran. So to your question, I would say I would offer two concrete steps. One is a recommendation. One is official recognition of the rights to resist and overthrow tyranny for the Iranian people. And by that, I mean governments should really publicly affirm that the Iranian people's right to fight against this dictatorship, to fight against the IRGC and the criminal Basij forces that are killing people in the street. Iranian people have a right to fight against them and determine their own future. That's number one. Number two is what we talked about earlier, is to really align with House Resolution 166. You know, in that resolution, it really outlines what really the United States should do. We should echo and advance the stance that is outlined in that resolution, which endorses an Iranian people's aspiration for a non-nuclear secular republic. So I think these are really actionable policy shifts that both the US and its allies can consider when it comes to dealing with Iran in a post-day 12-day war.
Dr. Sepehrrad, just before we go to audience questions, I do note the calendar, which 6 weeks from today is the beginning of the 80th United Nations General Assembly, and 2 weeks after that is the high-level general debate. What are OIAC's plans around the next 6 to 8 weeks?
I'm so glad you brought that up. I think, obviously, and Azadeh, please chime in, I think we are going to continue our campaign defense of political prisoners and their rights and highlight human rights violations. But more importantly, on September 23rd, OIAC is holding a massive rally outside of the UN to protest against regime's atrocity, but also to present a viable path forward and call for solidarity with the Iranian people as they stand for a non-nuclear secular republic. I don't know, Azadeh, if you want to chime in and add your perspective.
Absolutely. I agree 100% with what you said. And this, I want to also point out that this message has been one that has been pretty consistent. I mean, this has been the message that we've been having for years, to really listen to the Iranian people, listen to what they're saying, look at what the political prisoners are saying, look at what they've sacrificed, what they've given up. And, you know, we cannot stress this enough. I mean, if the international community's focus is on that, then we will all be on, you know, everybody will be on the right side of history with this. And so this rally coming up is as Dr. Sepehrrad was mentioning, is very, very key, very important, very timely. And so that's the plan that we have.
Thank you so much. We'd now like to take questions from our viewers and listeners in the audience. Again, there is a separate box for Q&A other than the chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A dialog box. Raise your hand and I will call on you, or we will take the questions from the Q&A box. Please keep your questions succinct so that we can get to as many as possible. I noticed that we have 3 questions right now in the dialog box. We will go to this one from Gila, and this we'll send this one to Dr. Sheehan, if you don't mind. Gila wants to know, how seriously do you take Reza Pahlavi's maneuvers in distracting the real movement for democracy?
Well, I don't take them all that seriously insofar as I think that anybody that's paying attention to Reza Pahlavi is playing directly in to the Ayatollah's hands. But the fact of the matter is he is garnering media visibility. And that's why I think it's so important for organizations like OIAC to call him out and lay bare the lack of support that he has inside of Iran. The fact of the matter is, as I said, there is a viable alternative in Iran, and it's inside the country. You know, Mark, there's only one opposition movement that has an intricate network of resistance units inside Iran, and that's the National Council of Resistance of Iran. When you look at the monarchists, there are small pockets of supporters around the world, and they spend a great deal of money, much of it probably taken from their time governing that country. But the fact of the matter is, we cannot rely as Western governments on media visibility to rule Iran. Ultimately, we need the political will and the organizational capacity. And there's only one movement that has those abilities.
Thank you, sir.
Mark, if you don't mind, I want to add to that question. I think Sascha nailed it. I would say Reza Pahlavi is also doing the bidding for the Iranian regime by distracting the message of the real movement for democracy. I think, obviously, if you look within his inner circle, he's surrounding himself with former IRGC, people that are very much deep in the regime's intelligence. And to Sascha's point, he really lacks the credibility. He has no established record or even demonstrated any seriousness or presented any reliable or credible plan to deliver something meaningful that the people of Iran can latch onto. So I think he has, if you look at the message that's coming from Iran, if you talk to the people in the street, he has no credibility. He has people are protesting inside Iran. They're saying, down with the dictators, be it the Shah or the Mullah. So from their perspective, Iranian people are not going back. Iranian people are not setting themselves up for another puppet regime. What's happening is a homegrown resistance movement, as Sascha mentioned, which is the resistance units with the National Council of Resistance with a very, very concrete plan. And that is what's resonating with the people of Iran. And so therefore, I would say I will not take him seriously at all.
If I could just add one point to that, you know, there was an interesting study undertaken by a late colleague of mine at the Iran Policy Committee a number of years ago, Professor Raymond Tanter. And he found that the Iranian regime pays approximately 350% more attention to the NCRI and the MEK than all other opposition movements combined. The fact of the matter is that after this live panel discussion goes live on YouTube, each of us here will be attacked relentlessly by the monarchist camp. I have been all summer. And that right there speaks volumes. When you've got a so-called opposition figure attacking the most viable opposition, that says that oppositionist is actually shilling for the mullahs and lacks the credibility to govern a post-theocracy Iran.
Next question comes from Azrael, and let's do Dr. Sepehrrad and Dr. Sami on this one. Quote, if external attacks on Iranian's nuclear facilities are not the solution and negotiations with the regime as appeasement, what solution is there to resolving the standoff over Iran's nuclear program? Dr. Sepehrrad, and then we'll go to Dr. Sami.
I would say, third option, which is supporting the Iranian people and their resistance movement to bring this regime down, will address the nuclear issue, will address the instability in the region, and will really put foreign policies with Iran on the right track, because at that point they'll be dealing with a non-nuclear secular republic that believes in coexistence with its neighbors in free market economy. So in my opinion, I think third option is the only viable path forward, because we've tried everything else that hasn't worked. We've tried everything else that has either come up short or has been ineffective or has failed. So this is the viable path moving forward, which is the third option.
Dr. Sami?
Yes, I echo everything Dr. Sepehrrad said. I mean, if you look at the history, as she was saying, all of those other methods have failed. They've been tried multiple times. And the third option, if you look at the 10-point plan that Mrs. Maryam Rajavi has laid out, if for anyone who takes the time to read it and try to understand it, who would disagree with any of the points in that plan? I mean, it's very democratic, very something that we can all agree to, and who would not want such a government instilled in Iran? And so I would agree. I think the third option is pretty much, now we're left with that is pretty much the only option at this point.
Can I just add one more thing? I think, Azadeh, what you brought up was important. Is many actually refer to the 10-point plan as a Jeffersonian plan. I think this was something that General Jones, the former national security advisor to President Obama, was the first one who coined that term and said it is a Jeffersonian plan. So absolutely, I think it not only resonates with what we understand as the democratic principles in the West, but more importantly, it resonates with the Iranian people. So I think that's going to be the only viable option.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. This is all the time that we have for today. Thank you all in the audience for joining us for this insightful discussion. Please email info@oiac.org, info@oiac.org for more information on future events. The replay of this webinar will be available shortly on OIAC's YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone. Good day to you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.